I have told this account twice. Once to the Boundary Station 9 Incident Review Panel, once to the Terran Containment Services Oversight Board when they were deciding whether to formally commend or formally reprimand Commander Joran Strauss for what he did with the TCS Comwater in the Varathen exclusion zone around the vessel Asavith correct. Both panels asked me the same question at the end. Did I believe, when I filed the dispatch recommendation, that I was sending help toward people who wanted it? I gave them the same answer both times. I said, I believed I was sending help toward a signal I could not fully explain. Whether the people on the other end wanted it was, at that point, not information I had. They wrote appropriate procedural judgment in the commendation and handed Strauss a certificate. They gave me a note in my file that said demonstrated initiative within protocol parameters. I framed neither of them. I keep this account instead. Here is what actually happened. I have been a comms officer at Boundary Station 9 for 11 years. The station sits at the edge of Varathen claimed space, not inside it, not at a formal crossing point, just a monitoring post where the Terran Coalition decided about 40 years ago that it would be useful to have a set of ears facing outward. The Varathen know the station is there. They have never asked us to move it. They have also never spoken to us directly, not once in those 40 years, which I took as a working definition of mutual tolerance. Not friendship, not hostility, just the quiet acknowledgement that we were there and they knew it, and whatever either of us did about the other was going to have to wait for a moment that had not yet arrived. Boundary Station 9 is not a glamorous posting. I want to be clear about that because the incident reports tend to make it sound like a critical intelligence node, which it is not. It is a station with 8 berths, a common room the size of a cargo container, monitoring equipment that was refurbished rather than replaced in its last overhaul cycle, because the budget line was moved to a different priority, and a view of deep space that is spectacular in the way that anything is spectacular when you look at it long enough with nothing else to look at. There are no bars within reach. There is no relief rotation fast enough to matter if something goes wrong. There is the work, and there is the equipment, and there is whatever you bring with you in the way of patience and discipline, and the ability to sit quietly with a console for extended periods without inventing problems that are not there. I am good at the sitting quietly. 11 years has confirmed this about me. The station runs a crew of 8 on any given rotation, plus the AI monitoring suite we call Patience, not because it is patient, which it isn't, but because the original system designation was PAT 9 ENS, and the abbreviation stuck. Patience monitors approximately 4,000 frequency ranges simultaneously, flags anomalies against a classification library, and routes anything it considers actionable to the duty comms officer for human review. Most of what it flags is noise. Cosmic drift, ancient signal echoes, the occasional navigational ping from a vessel that wandered closer to our position than their charts suggested, was necessary. Interference patterns from a pulsar in the adjacent sector that Patience has flagged, corrected, and reflagged approximately 600 times in my tenure, because the correction does not survive a firmware update. In 11 years, Patience had correctly flagged 17 items that required a response dispatch. I had reviewed all 17. I had agreed with 12 of them and overridden 5. The morning Patience flagged the Varathen quarantine burst. I was on my 3rd cup of coffee, and halfway through an equipment maintenance form that needed to be submitted before the end of the rotation. Station 9 operates on a 12-hour duty cycle, and the overnight watch is mine by seniority. I chose it deliberately when I took the posting because the overnight watch has fewer interruptions, which I value, and because the 6 hours of relative quiet before the first frequency calibration checks of the day are the best hours I have found for the kind of sustained attention that monitoring work requires. Most nights nothing interesting happens, and I am fine with that. The maintenance forms get done, the calibration logs get written, the equipment checks are completed, and the station continues its work. It was, by any metric, a quiet morning. Patients gave the incoming signal a Class 2 flag, which, in its classification library, means possible distress, recommend human review before dispatch. Class 1 is confirmed distress, dispatch immediately. Class 3 is anomaly, no action needed. I had never seen patients hand me a Class 2 that turned out to be nothing. I had also never seen it hand me a Class 2 that turned out to be a signal that was actively telling ships to stay away from something. So in that sense, the morning was entirely outside my prior experience. The burst came in at 6:14 station time. Duration, 11 seconds. Patients had it broken down for me by 6:18, a tight band transmission on what it had catalogued as frequency group VETH7, the Varathen outer emergency spectrum, which it had been monitoring since the station's founding on the assumption that if the Varathen ever had an emergency near our edge of their claimed space, we would want to know about it. In 40 years, nothing had come in on group VETH7. Until that morning. The encoding was the first thing that troubled me. Varathen communication encoding. And I want to be clear that what I knew about Varathen encoding could fill perhaps 4 pages of a technical document, because they do not share their communication standards with anyone, has certain structural markers that patients had assembled from indirect observation over 4 decades. Signal compression ratios, header patterns, the way their transmissions open and close. The methodology was, essentially, this. Every time a Varathen vessel transited the corridor near our monitoring range, and we caught any fragment of its internal communications as bleed-through, patients filed the fragment against its growing model of what Varathen signals look like. 4 decades of fragments carefully indexed. It was not a complete picture. It was better than nothing, which in this line of work is often the operating standard. The VETH7 burst hit all the expected structural markers, which told me it was definitely Varathen and definitely on their emergency spectrum. What patients had done next was where the trouble started. Patients had a frequency pairing table, a legacy mapping system that correlated known alien emergency spectra to the closest functional equivalent on the Terran Coalition emergency band structure. The table existed because when the station was built, the thinking was that knowing the alien equivalent of our Mayday band would help us recognize distress signals from species we had limited knowledge of. It was a reasonable idea. The table had been updated 6 times in 40 years, and the last update was 9 years before I arrived at the station. I had flagged this in my first-year evaluation and been told that a comprehensive update was planned for the next overhaul cycle. The next overhaul cycle came, and the table update moved to a lower priority line because the equipment work consumed more hours than projected. I flagged it again in my 5th-year evaluation. I was told the same thing. What the table said about frequency group VETH7 was that it corresponded, functionally, to Terran Coalition Emergency Spectrum Band 4, which is, in our classification, the General Distress Band. The band you use when you need help and you need it now. The logic behind that classification, as best I could reconstruct from the notes in the table record, was that VETH7 was the highest priority allocation in the Varathen outer emergency spectrum, and Band 4 was the highest priority allocation in our general emergency structure, and the table compiler had matched them on that basis. Priority to priority. What the table did not know, because nobody had told it, because nobody had ever received a Varathen transmission on group VETH7 before, was that the Varathen emergency spectrum is not organized the way ours is. They do not have one band for general distress, and another band for navigational warnings, and another band for hazard advisories, with priority mapped from most urgent to least. Their priority structure runs on a different axis entirely. Group VETH7, as I learned several weeks after this incident when the Varathen finally sent us a formal communication about the whole affair, is their priority containment band. The band used exclusively for quarantine and exclusion orders. The highest priority in their emergency spectrum because, In their operational philosophy, a contamination event that spreads is a worse outcome than a ship that dies contained. The most urgent thing you can do is tell everyone to stay away, and the ban for telling everyone to stay away is therefore the highest priority ban they have. The ban, in other words, for telling ships to stay clear. Patients did not know this. Patience's table said group VETH7 meant general distress. Patients classified the 11-second burst as a class 2 possible distress and put it on my screen, and I sat with it for 22 minutes before I touched anything. The encoding was wrong for a standard distress call, even accounting for the species difference, even allowing for the fact that Varathen communication is not Terran communication, and I should not expect it to behave like one of our Mayday signals. Something in the structure of the burst was not doing what a distress call does. A distress call reaches out. It is expansive by design. The signal shape is engineered to be detectable by as many receivers as possible across the widest practical range, because the goal is to maximize the probability that anyone will hear it and respond. This burst was the opposite. It was tight, directional, and aimed. Not toward us, we were receiving it on a side lobe bleed from the main beam's margin, not on the main beam itself. The main beam was aimed somewhere else, somewhere deeper into Varathen space, back the way it came. A distress call that aims itself inward at the people who sent it is not a distress call. That was my working hypothesis at minute 22. I wrote it down, not on the official review form. The official review form does not have a field for working hypotheses, but in a separate document I keep for exactly this kind of reasoning. A comms officer who spends 11 years with a quiet console develops certain habits of analysis, and one of mine is to write down what I think before I start looking for confirmation, because confirmation bias in monitoring work is a failure mode that gets people sent to the wrong place at the wrong time. I wrote, signal is inward aimed, side lobe reception only, main beam directed back toward Varathen space. This is inconsistent with distress call design. Alternative classification to consider. Hazard advisory aimed at Varathen vessels. Do not clear on this basis, insufficient certainty, but note the inconsistency. Then I pulled the burst structural data and looked at the directionality mapping for 40 minutes, cross-referencing with the historical records of the 17 prior anomalies patients had flagged, looking for anything that had shown the same inward-aimed quality. Nothing had. All 17 prior flags, including the 5 I had overridden as non-distress, had been outward-aimed or non-directional. This one was inward-aimed. Deliberately, precisely, consistently inward-aimed across its 11-second duration. The beam geometry was coherent throughout, not a signal that had drifted or scattered, but a signal that had been shaped and pointed with intention. I wrote that down too and added, this signal is not trying to be found by anyone outside Varathen space. We found it by accident, on the margin of a beam aimed elsewhere. This is relevant to classification. The protocol for a Class 2 flag is as follows. The duty comms officer reviews the signal, makes a determination within 2 hours of the flag time, and either clears it as non-actionable or routes a dispatch recommendation to the nearest available Terran Coalition response vessel. The protocol does not have a category for, I believe this is not a distress call but I cannot prove it, and the frequency pairing table says it might be 1, and the table is known to be out of date but I have not had authorization to update it. The protocol has 2 paths, clear it or route it. I spent the remaining 80 minutes of my 2-hour window building the strongest possible case for clearing it. I could not make the case. Every time I constructed a reason why the burst was not a distress call, the inward aim, the tight directional beam, the encoding structure that did not match our distress architecture, I was forced to confront the same counterargument. I was reasoning from incomplete information about a species whose communication standards I did not have. The inward aim could mean it was an advisory and not a request for help. It could also mean it was a distress call aimed at internal Varathen responders who were not, from the Varathen perspective, close enough. I could not eliminate that possibility. The encoding inconsistency could mean the signal was not a distress call. It could also mean the Varathen simply encode their distress calls differently than we do, which would be entirely unsurprising. I could not eliminate that possibility either. I was not clearing the signal because I was certain it was not a distress call. I was wanting to clear it because I suspected it was not one, and had a set of structural arguments that supported the suspicion without confirming it. Suspicion supported by structural arguments is not the same as certainty. The protocol does not permit clearing a class 2 on suspicion. The protocol requires a determination, and the only determination I could honestly write down was, cannot confirm distress, cannot confirm non-distress, proceeding to dispatch recommendation with note of anomaly. At 8:16 station time, I routed a dispatch recommendation to TCS Comwater, which patients had already identified as the nearest available response vessel. A Terran containment services ship currently 3 days out from our position on a routine survey run through the adjacent transit corridor. I know about Comwater's operational profile because I pull the registry data on every vessel that comes within monitoring range of Station 9. It is a habit I started in my second year and have maintained because it occasionally matters, and this was one of the occasions where it mattered considerably. Comwater was a Class 4 containment vessel, formerly registered as a nuclear material transport under a civilian carrier contract, refitted and reclassified by Terran Containment Services 8 years prior for general hazardous material response work. Crew of 19, equipped with a biological isolation suite, a decontamination processing unit, and a small-scale analysis laboratory. Not a warship, not a rescue ship in the conventional sense. A ship designed to get close to dangerous things and manage them carefully. I routed the dispatch recommendation, flagged it with a priority note reading signal structure anomalous, possible non-distress. Recommend crew review upon approach before full commitment to rescue posture. Duty comms officer has reservations about classification but cannot clear under current protocol. And then I sat down and opened a blank document. I was certain I would need the correction memo. I wrote it in advance, which is something you are technically not supposed to do because it implies a determination before the situation has resolved, but which anyone who has worked a monitoring post for more than 3 years understands is a reasonable way to spend the time between a decision you suspect was wrong and the moment you find out. Waiting without writing is just waiting. Writing the correction memo in advance is at least productive, and it forces you to articulate exactly why you think you made the error, which turns out to be useful information if you later discover you did not. The correction memo began. It is the opinion of this officer that the dispatch recommendation filed at 8:16 on the above date was made in good faith, but may represent a misclassification of an inward-aimed non-distress signal on the Varathen Priority Containment spectrum, assuming that the Varathen Priority Containment spectrum exists and that frequency group VETH7 is its correct designation. This determination cannot be verified with current available information. I wrote 8 more paragraphs. They documented, in order, the structural analysis of the burst, the directionality data, the known limitations of the frequency pairing table, the protocol requirements that prevented clearing, the reasons for suspecting non-distress classification, and the specific language of the anomaly note I had attached to the dispatch recommendation. The 8th paragraph said, "This officer recommends that upon resolution of this incident, the frequency pairing table be reviewed and updated with respect to Varathen spectrum classifications, and that any future Varathen transmission on group VETH7 be held for extended human review before dispatch authorization." Then I saved the document and went back to the equipment maintenance form. The Comwater would take 3 days to reach the area. I had 3 days to find out whether I needed to send the memo. I completed the maintenance form. I ran the calibration checks. I made another pot of coffee and drank most of it while reviewing the directionality data one more time, not because I expected to find anything new, but because looking at it again was better than sitting with nothing to do except wait. I found out in 2 days, not 3. At 3:41 on the second day, patients flagged a new transmission. This one a direct hail, tight beam, aimed specifically at Station 9's receiver array. It was on standard coalition frequency, not Varathen encoding, which meant whoever was sending it had a coalition standard transmitter aboard or had access to one. I picked it up personally because I was on overnight watch, and because the only thing interesting enough to stay awake for at 3:41 in the middle of a 3-day wait is a direct hail from a direction where there should not be one. There are no coalition vessels in that sector that I knew of. There are no independent operators licensed to transit that corridor without a filing that would have come through Station 9's registry. The hail was from a direction that should have had nothing in it except Varathen space, and somewhere inside it, whatever had generated the original burst. The hail identified itself as originating from the Varathen outer quarantine vessel Kesaveth Warden, Quarantine Marshal Sethavel Earn commanding, currently maintaining exclusion position at a designated distance from vessel Asaveth correct. It requested, in careful and formal coalition standard phrasing that suggested someone had spent a significant amount of time with a translation reference document before composing the message, that Boundary Station 9 explain why a Terran containment vessel was on an approach vector toward the Varathen exclusion perimeter. I stared at the message for a long moment. The Varathen outer quarantine vessel Kesaveth Warden, Quarantine Marshal, exclusion perimeter, vessel Asaveth correct. I pulled up the structural analysis I had done on the original 11-second burst and looked at the directionality mapping one more time. Inward aimed, tight directional beam, not reaching out, reaching back. I went and got a 4th cup of coffee. I did not particularly want it. Making it gave me something to do with my hands for 3 minutes while I decided how to respond to the first direct communication the Varathen had ever sent to Boundary Station 9 in 40 years of the station's existence. Then I sent the correction memo to the incident review queue, flagged it for immediate processing, and opened a response channel to Marshal Earn. I introduced myself by name and rank, identified Boundary Station 9 as a Terran Coalition monitoring station, positioned at the edge of Varathen claimed space under a standing border monitoring protocol that both governments had acknowledged in an agreement signed 22 years prior. I explained that approximately 2 days ago our monitoring systems had received a transmission on what we had classified, based on our existing records, as a Varathen emergency frequency. I told him that our classification systems had identified the transmission as a possible distress signal, and that based on that classification, a Terran Containment Services vessel, the TCS Comwater, had been dispatched on an advisory basis. I told him that Comwater was approximately 22 hours from the perimeter he had described, and that I was alerting him to its approach so there would be no misunderstanding about its origin or purpose. Then I said, I want to be transparent with you, Marshal Earn. Our classification records may have misidentified the nature of your transmission. If the signal we received was not a request for assistance, but rather an advisory directed at Varathen vessels, which the structural characteristics of the signal suggest may be the case, I apologize for the confusion, and I can contact Comwater to redirect to its prior survey route. I sent the message and settled in to wait. His response took 4 hours. I spent those 4 hours completing every piece of outstanding administrative work on my console, running calibration checks that had already been run once that cycle, reviewing the burst data for what had become a routine repetition rather than a productive analysis, and then sitting with my hands flat on the console and doing nothing, which is not something I am temperamentally suited to, but which is occasionally what the situation calls for. When Ern's response came, it was longer than his first message and more careful in its construction. I could tell, from the way the sentences were structured, that he had not composed it alone. There were sections that read like his original voice, precise and formally weighted, and sections that had been reviewed and adjusted, where the phrasing was a little too smooth, a little too carefully balanced. Someone else had looked at it before he sent it. A superior officer, possibly, or a legal advisor. Someone whose job it was to make sure that the first extended communication between the Varathen Outer Quarantine Bureau and a Terran monitoring station said what it needed to say without creating problems it did not intend to create. He said, "The transmission your station received was a Priority Containment advisory issued by the Varathen Outer Quarantine Bureau, directed to Varathen sector patrol vessels operating in the adjacent transit corridor, informing them of the mandatory exclusion perimeter around vessel Asavith Correct and the nature of the contamination event aboard that vessel. The transmission was not a request for assistance. It was not directed at your station or at any Terran Coalition receiver. We understand that your monitoring station received the transmission on a side lobe incident, which is a consequence of the proximity of your station to the transmission origin point, and was not anticipated in our protocol for containment advisory broadcasts." He paused there. In the message, it was a paragraph break, but it was longer than the others. I could tell from the segment timestamps embedded in the transmission header. A deliberate pause, a gap where something was being decided about what came next. Then he said, "Vessel Asavith Correct is a Varathen long-range survey vessel that returned to the outer transit corridor 7 days ago from a mapping expedition to the Keth corridor margins. Upon return, 41 of the vessel's 68 crew members were displaying symptoms consistent with exposure to an uncharacterized biological contaminant acquired during the expedition. The contaminant appears to have been present in particulate matter samples collected at 3 survey sites in the outer Keth region. Exposure occurred during sample processing work aboard the vessel, before the samples were sealed. The vessel's medical systems have been unable to synthesize an effective treatment protocol. The pathogen's interaction with Varathen immune response architecture is not consistent with any cataloged organism in our medical database. Of the 41 initially symptomatic crew members, 7 have died in the past 2 days. The remaining 34 are in various stages of progression. The 27 crew members who were not exposed have been placed in a sealed isolation section of the vessel pending outcome. The Varathen Medical Authority has dispatched a review vessel, which is 11 days out from this position. We have maintained exclusion perimeter as required by protocol. The situation is, to use the terminology your coalition would likely apply, serious." He paused again, longer this time. He said, "I will not present this account as anything other than what it is. Our medical authority vessel has the capability to address this class of situation. It is simply not here yet. The protocols we have implemented are containment protocols, not treatment protocols, because we do not currently have the tools for treatment aboard the vessels present. I will ask you directly, does TCS Comwater have any relevant capability for this type of situation? Or is its presence here purely the result of the misclassification you have described? And would you be redirecting it regardless of my response?" I read that message 3 times. There were things in it that I noted but did not act on immediately. The specificity of the account, 41 symptomatic, 7 dead, 11 days until the medical authority vessel, 27 crew in isolation, pathogen not in the database. He did not have to give me those details. His first response had established that the original transmission was a containment advisory, not a distress call, and that would have been sufficient to end the exchange. He had given me the additional information anyway. And then he had asked the direct question. I forwarded the entire exchange to Comwater's communications officer with a message that said, "Captain Strauss, please review the attached and advise on Comwater's relevant capability for a biological contamination event of the type described before I formulate a response to the Varathen Quarantine Authority. I need an accurate assessment of what we can offer before I say anything further. Strauss's response came back in 40 minutes. He had clearly already been briefed on the exchange situation. My anomaly note had reached him on day 1, and he had spent the 2 days of transit reviewing everything patients had captured of the original Varathen burst. His response was not a long document. It was a short one, but it was precise in the way that people are precise when they know what they have and have already been thinking about whether it is relevant. He said, "Comwater is a Class 4 containment vessel. Our primary contract work is nuclear material transport and spill response, but the equipment generalizes. We carry a full biological isolation, suite rated for Category 3 hazard levels, a decontamination processing unit capable of cycling through 60 individuals in sequence with a clean turnaround time of approximately 40 minutes per person, and an onboard analysis laboratory that we use for isotope characterization work in the radioactive material contracts. That laboratory can be reconfigured for biological sample analysis. I have already spoken to our chief engineer, and she estimates 6 hours for the reconfiguration and verification cycle. We also have Dr. Thessaly Rern as our medical officer. Dr. Rern spent 8 years with the Coalition Epidemic Response Division before she joined this ship, with specific experience in novel pathogen characterization and containment protocol development. She has reviewed the available details of the Varathen situation from your transmitted exchange and says, and I am quoting her directly, that she cannot promise anything, but she has worked with less information and worse equipment and found useful things, and she would like the opportunity to look at the biological sample data." He paused at that point. The audio on his message had a brief intake of breath. He said, "I would like your authorization to continue our current approach vector and to establish direct communication with the Varathen quarantine officer. If they want us to leave after we have made clear what we are carrying and what we can do, we will leave. But I would like to make sure they know what we are bringing before they make that decision, because it seems to me that the decision they make without that information is not necessarily the decision they would make with it, and in 11 days, a lot of people can die. That is not pressure on you. You are the one with the decision in front of you. I am telling you what I think so you can make it with full information." I sat with that response for 12 minutes. I counted. Then I authorized the approach continuation and sent a message to Ern that told him, "Comwater is a Class 4 hazardous material containment vessel with biological isolation and decontamination capability, a reconfigurable analysis laboratory, and a medical officer with specific experience in novel pathogen characterization. We are not claiming this as a solution to your situation. We are offering it as a resource, and we believe you should have complete information about what the resource is before you decide whether you want it present or redirected. We are happy to respect whatever decision you reach. Comwater's commanding officer, Commander Strauss, is opening a direct channel to your vessel and will discuss capability parameters in whatever level of technical detail you require." Then I went back to the correction memo and added a paragraph. The paragraph documented what I had done and why, and it concluded, "This officer makes no claim that the dispatch was correct in its original premise. The dispatch was made on a misclassification. What the officer does claim is that the capability present aboard Comwater is materially relevant to the situation described by Marshal Ern, and that redirecting Comwater without providing the Varathen Authority with complete information about that capability would be a failure to act on available information, which is, in this officer's judgment, a different kind of error." I saved the document again and let Strauss and Ern run their channel. What happened between Strauss and Ern over the next 18 hours is something I know mostly from the communication logs and from what Strauss described to me afterward, because I was not on the channel for most of it. I listened to the first hour and then took myself off because The level of technical detail being negotiated was beyond my expertise, and my presence on the channel was adding nothing except traffic. What I know is this: they talked for a long time. Strauss had Dr. Rern on the channel from the beginning, and Rern had his ship's senior medical officer, a Varathen physician whose name I have seen rendered in Coalition Standard 3 different ways across 3 different documents, and who I will simply refer to as the medical representative. The 4 of them worked through the technical details of the situation, the nature of the contaminant as understood by the Varathen, the symptom progression timeline, the isolation protocols currently in place aboard Asavith Correct, the containment measures the Kesavith Warden was maintaining, and then, progressively, the equipment capability of Comwater and what it would and would not be able to do. The compatibility questions were substantial. Varathen biology is not human biology. Their quarantine protocols are designed for their physiology, which differs from ours in ways that are not always obvious from the outside, but become immediately relevant when you are talking about decontamination cycles, personal protective equipment interfaces, and sample analysis protocols built around Varathen's cellular structure. The equipment on Comwater was designed for human and near-human applications. Each compatibility question had to be worked through individually. Could this be adapted? What would the adaptation require? How long would it take? And what was the confidence level that the adaptation would work correctly? Strauss's chief engineer, Specialist Commander Hellos Dane, was on the technical channel for most of those 18 hours, and from what Strauss told me afterward, Dane's contribution was as significant as Rern's. She was the one who looked at each compatibility problem and either found the workaround or told them clearly when there was none, and they needed to think differently. There were problems they could not solve. There were protocols Comwater simply could not perform for Varathen physiology with its existing equipment. Rern and his medical representative were clear about which those were, and Strauss and Rern were clear about which problems they thought they could address and which they could not. What came out of those 18 hours was not a comprehensive solution. It was an accurate inventory of what was possible, negotiated between people who had never worked together before under conditions that did not allow for imprecision. The agreement they reached: Comwater would enter the exclusion perimeter. It would not approach vessel Asavith Correct directly. The Kesavith Warden would remain between the 2 vessels at all times, and no personnel would cross between ships without a full decontamination pass at both ends, following a protocol that Rern and the medical representative would develop jointly and verify before any personnel movement. Comwater's analysis laboratory, once reconfigured, would receive biological sample data from the Varathen medical team, data only, transmitted over secure channel, no physical samples transferred, and would run characterization analysis using Rern's protocols. Any findings would be returned to the Varathen medical officer for integration into their treatment effort. If the reconfigured decontamination suite could be adapted to process Varathen physiology, it would be made available for the crew of Asavith Correct after treatment was administered, in whatever sequence the Varathen Medical Authority determined appropriate. It was not the arrangement either side would have designed from scratch if they had been planning a joint operation. It was built entirely from what was actually present, what was actually compatible, and what the people involved actually believed they could do. That is a different kind of arrangement, and in my experience it is the kind that either holds completely or fails in ways you did not anticipate. This one held. Comwater entered the Varathen exclusion perimeter at 11:40 on what was now the 4th day since the original burst. The vessel Asavith Correct was a large ship, a long-range survey vessel, which in Varathen service means something built for extended independent operation, heavily provisioned, with substantially more internal volume than a military vessel of comparable external dimensions. It was a working ship, the kind of ship that is built to go somewhere difficult and stay there long enough to actually accomplish something. Standing off the perimeter on Comwater's sensors, it read as a solid, practical hull, not elegant, functional. The kind of ship whose crew trusts it because it has given them reason to. It was also, by the time Comwater arrived, a ship in serious trouble. The 41 symptomatic crew members had moved through 3 stages of the contaminant's progression over the preceding week. The first stage, from what the Varathen medical data described, was respiratory, labored breathing, pressure in the upper chest, declining oxygen transfer efficiency. The second stage was neurological, coordination problems, speech difficulties, periods of confusion that lengthened over time. The third stage, which approximately a third of the symptomatic crew had reached, was systemic failure. 7 of them had died in the 2 days before Comwater's arrival. The remaining 34 were in various stages, distributed unevenly, some still in the early respiratory phase, some in the neurological phase, some at the boundary of the third stage that the Varathen medical data described with the precise and terrible clarity of a medical report that is trying to be accurate because accuracy is all that is left. Dr. Rern received the biological sample data through the secure channel at 1410 on the day Comwater entered the perimeter. She had the analysis laboratory reconfigured and verified by 1820. Dane's team had done the hardware work in 5 hours and 40 minutes, 20 minutes ahead of the estimate, and she ran the sample data through her first characterization pass overnight. At 2:30 the following morning, she sent Strauss a brief message and asked him to forward it to Ern's medical representative immediately. The message said, "The pathogen exhibits an inhibitor mechanism I have not seen documented in the Varathen medical literature you shared, but which has a functional analog in 2 human viral pathogens from the late pre-expansion period. The mechanism suppresses a specific class of immune response signaling proteins by binding to their precursor sites. This is why your antiviral protocols have not been effective. They are targeting the wrong stage of the pathogen's interaction with the host. The correct target is the inhibitor binding site, not the pathogen's replication mechanism. I am attaching a detailed characterization document. I cannot tell you how to build a treatment protocol. I do not know your medical pharmacology well enough to specify which compounds would work for your physiology. What I can tell you is what the correct target is, and I believe your medical representative has the knowledge to build from that." She paused in the audio. She had recorded the message rather than writing it, which was a choice I noted when I reviewed the log later, because Rern, from everything I had seen in the communications archive, was a written record person. She had chosen audio for this message. She went on, "I need to be clear that this characterization is based on 12 hours of analysis of indirect sample data, not a direct sample examination, and my model is being applied across a significant species physiology gap. I have flagged the confidence intervals in the characterization document. I believe the core finding is solid. I could be wrong about the target specifics in ways I cannot fully model from here. Please treat this as a strong hypothesis, not a confirmed result, and build your protocol with that understanding." She paused again. She said, "I hope it helps." The Varathen medical representative worked with Rern's characterization document for 6 hours. They exchanged 9 messages during that time, technical and precise, without any ceremony on either side. The representative confirmed the inhibitor mechanism from Rern's characterization document against their own database. They found a partial match in a Varathen study of a pathogen from a different region, which had been dismissed as a methodological artifact at the time and had never been followed up. The partial match confirmed the binding site target. They built a treatment protocol around the inhibitor mechanism, rather than the replication mechanism, and administered it to the symptomatic crew members in order of urgency. 11 of the 34 surviving symptomatic crew members responded to the protocol. The 11 who responded were the ones still in the respiratory or early neurological phase, the ones for whom the inhibitor mechanism had not yet caused enough systemic damage that correcting it could reverse the progression. 23 did not respond. They were past the window. The damage was not reversible. They died over the following 3 days, inside the exclusion perimeter, while Comwater held position off the Kesavith Warden's bow. Strauss stood down his crew from non-essential duties for those 3 days. He told them they were on support watch. There was nothing for them to do in practical terms. The analysis was complete. The treatment had been administered. The outcome for the 23 was set. Being present was the only thing left, and he made the decision that being present was something his crew would do. He told me afterward that he was not certain it was the right call in any operational sense, and that if I asked him to explain the reasoning he would have difficulty doing so. He said, "I thought it mattered to them that we were still there." He meant the Varathen. Whether it did, and in what way, is not something I can verify. I believe Strauss was right that it mattered to him, and I will let the rest stand without further interpretation. What the crew actually did during those 3 days, from what Strauss described to me, was work. Dane's engineering team used the standby time to begin the decontamination adaptation in careful stages, working through each compatibility problem against the Varathen technical specifications that ERN's officers were transmitting across the secure Channel 1 section at a time. It was slow, methodical work. ERN stayed on open channel with the medical representative for most of it, not because medical guidance was required for the engineering work, but because she was monitoring the symptomatic crew's progression data as it came through and had told Strauss she wanted to be available if the treatment picture changed in any way that might open a new line of analysis. It did not change. The treatment picture stayed exactly what it was, which was a partial result, and ERN stayed on the channel anyway, and the Varathen medical representative stayed on the other end, and the two of them did not talk much, but they did not close the channel. I have thought about that a great deal. 2 medical officers, neither with anything useful left to do, keeping an open channel between them for 3 days, while 23 people died on the other side of a quarantine line. I am not a sentimental person by training or by disposition, and I recognize that an open channel between 2 professionals during a crisis situation may simply be a practical measure, in case something changes, in case a new data point appears, in case a question needs to be asked quickly. That is a reasonable explanation. It is also not, in my judgment, the complete explanation. But the complete explanation is not something I can write in an incident account, so I note the fact and move forward. The 11 surviving symptomatic crew members and the 27 crew members who had been in isolation throughout the event underwent the decontamination process over the following 2 days. This was where Comwater's equipment was most directly useful, and where the 3 days of adaptation work paid out. Dane's team and the Varathen technical officers from the Kesavith Warden had built the adapted protocol in careful stages, verifying each component against Varathen physiological parameters before adding the next. Dane described the collaboration in her engineering log as, and I am quoting her directly, because her phrasing was more precise than anything I would produce on the subject, the most demanding improvisation I have done since the Kelvar Station methane event, conducted with people I had never met before who knew exactly what they needed, and were not interested in softening that information for diplomatic reasons, which was frankly a relief. The Varathen technical officers, reading that description in the formal release, did not comment publicly. I suspect they regarded it as accurate. The adaptation was not perfect. Nothing built in 3 days by teams working across a significant technical and physiological gap, under conditions that did not allow for full testing before implementation, is perfect. But it worked. ERN and the medical representative verified each decontamination cycle before the next one began, and the protocol held across all 38 surviving crew members, and when the Varathen Medical Authority vessel arrived 3 days ahead of its original schedule, Ern had filed an expedited response request the day after the treatment was administered, citing active containment progress as the basis. The contamination event on vessel Asavith Correct had been managed to closure. The medical authority vessel's commanding officer was not pleased to find a Terran containment ship inside the exclusion perimeter. There was a formal exchange of communications at administrative register that I was not party to, but which Ern described in his incident report as procedurally necessary and substantively unambiguous. Ern filed his report in full, with all supporting logs and the complete communication record going back to his initial hail to Station 9. He is, from what I can gather from the formal release, an officer who does not summarize when the complete record is available, and who regards the complete record as the appropriate basis for any determination that a superior authority might need to make. His report documented the events in sequence. It documented the misclassification and the dispatch. It documented the direct communication with Station 9 and the subsequent exchange with Commander Strauss and Dr. Rern. It documented the agreement reached and the protocols followed. It documented Rern's characterization finding and the medical representative's treatment protocol derivation from it. It documented the decontamination adaptation and its results. And then it said what the results were. He said, "It is accurate to state that the analytical contribution made by the Terran vessel's medical officer identified a feature of the pathogen's interaction mechanism that our existing protocols had not characterized, and that this identification contributed to the derivation of a treatment protocol that resulted in the survival of 11 crew members of the vessel Asavith Correct. Those 11 crew members' survival is directly attributable to the treatment protocol. The treatment protocol is directly attributable to the pathogen characterization. The pathogen characterization was performed by Dr. Thessaly Rern of the Terran Containment Services vessel Comwater. I have stated this as precisely as I can because I want the record to be accurate." He paused there. The document had a section break at that point, longer than the others. He said, "It is further accurate to state that the decontamination processing performed by the Terran vessel's adapted equipment, in collaboration with the technical officers of the Kesavith Warden, reduced the total duration of the active contamination event and cleared the surviving crew of the vessel Asavith Correct in advance of the medical authority vessel's arrival. The adaptation was improvised and imperfect and was verified step by both parties, and it functioned." He said, "I am not in a position to authorize the Terran vessel's presence in the exclusion perimeter retroactively. I am in a position to document what it did while it was present. I have done so." He paused again. He said, "It is my recommendation that the Varathen Outer Quarantine Bureau establish a formal communication protocol with Boundary Listening Station 9 for the purpose of clarifying the technical parameters of priority containment transmissions and preventing future misclassification events. It is my further recommendation that this protocol include a provision for direct notification to the Bureau in the event that the Terran Monitoring Station detects any future transmission on the Varathen emergency spectrum. The events of the past 14 days suggest that a clarified communication channel between our two organizations would be of operational value. I make no further recommendation about the nature of that relationship, as that is beyond my authority. I note only that the capability demonstrated by the Terran vessel was relevant to our situation, and that whether or not the Terran vessel's presence was authorized, the capability was real." That was the end of the section. Comwater left the Varathen exclusion perimeter on the day the medical authority vessel arrived. Strauss did not wait to be asked. He had told Ern at the beginning of the medical authority vessel's approach that Comwater would clear the perimeter on schedule, and he cleared it on schedule. He said what he said to every person who asked him afterward about the decision to continue the approach rather than reroute when they learned the signal had been a stand-away order. He said Rern had looked at the data and said there was something she might be able to do, And in his experience, when your medical officer says there is something she might be able to do, you give her the chance to try. The Oversight Board wrote appropriate operational judgment in the commendation. They also gave Vern a citation, which she kept, Strauss told me, in a drawer in her quarters aboard Comwater and never mentioned unless someone asked. Dane received a technical commendation from the Containment Services Engineering Division for the decontamination adaptation. She put hers on the common room wall of the Comwater, where it apparently remained for the duration of the ship's next contract. I read Ern's formal report in the diplomatic release 3 months after the incident. I had been waiting for it. When it came through, I read it twice, the whole thing, not just the summary, and then I opened the correction memo I had been carrying in my working files since the morning of the incident. The correction memo had 9 paragraphs by that point. I had been adding to it periodically as new information arrived, not because I needed to keep updating it. The incident review panel had already closed the case, but because I wanted the account to be complete. I had, at the beginning, been writing a memo that explained why I had made a mistake. As the weeks went on, I had become less certain about the nature of what I had made. Whether a decision made in good faith, on incomplete information, using the best protocol available, that resulted in an outcome better than the alternative, whether that is properly described as a mistake is a question I find I do not have a clean answer to. It was certainly not the right decision for the right reasons. Whether it was the right decision at all depends on how you count the 38 people who died against the 11 who did not, against the 27 in isolation who were decontaminated and cleared, against the formal communication protocol that now exists between the Bureau and Station 9, against the updated frequency pairing table that Patience runs correctly as of 4 months ago. The accounting is not simple. The correction memo sat in my files with the cursor blinking at the end of the 9th paragraph for about an hour after I read Ern's report. Then I deleted the file header that said correction memo and replaced it with post-incident account. That felt more accurate. I added a 10th paragraph. The 10th paragraph reads, Marshal Ern's report recommends the establishment of a formal communication protocol between the Varathen Outer Quarantine Bureau and Boundary Listening Station 9. This station endorses that recommendation. The frequency pairing table that classified the initial priority containment burst as a general distress signal has been flagged for update pending technical consultation with the Bureau. It is the opinion of this officer that the updated table should distinguish, at minimum, between the Varathen Priority Containment spectrum and the Varathen General Emergency spectrum, and that the Bureau should be notified directly of any future detection of priority containment transmissions before a dispatch recommendation is filed. It is further the opinion of this officer that the protocol should include a provision for the Bureau to request Terran monitoring station assistance in contamination events where Terran capability is assessed as relevant, should such a request ever be of value to them. We have demonstrated at least once that our equipment and our people can be made relevant. Whether they ever want to make use of that again is their choice. I saved the document. Then I made another pot of coffee and went back to the monitoring console, because there were approximately 4,000 frequency ranges to watch. And Patience, for all its usefulness, benefits from someone who has learned the difference between a signal that is reaching out and a signal that is reaching back, and can sit with the uncertainty when the difference is not immediately clear. I will tell you the thing I think about most. When I think about the Osavith Correct and the Comwater and the 11 crew members who made it. I think about Ern's segment break in the middle of his first response to me, the long one, that came after he had described the situation, 41 symptomatic, 7 dead, 11 days until the medical authority vessel, and before he asked me directly whether Comwater had anything relevant to offer. The break was long enough that I noticed it in the message structure. A deliberate pause in a carefully composed formal communication from a quarantine officer who was trained to be precise about everything he put in writing. He had just told a Terran comms officer that he had a dying ship and a long wait and inadequate tools. And then he had paused before asking whether the misrouted response vessel that had shown up uninvited might have anything on board worth keeping around. He could have said, "Your vessel will please maintain position while we verify the dispatch authorization." He could have said that, and it would have been the correct procedural language for the situation, and it would have been the end of it. He paused instead, and then he asked, "That is not nothing. That is a person deciding, in the middle of a formal communication that he had every reason to keep purely procedural, to also make it a question, to leave open a door that protocol did not require him to leave open." Strauss, when I mentioned this to him, said he thought I was probably reading too much into the message structure, and that Ern had most likely paused because he was choosing his translation terms carefully. Strauss is probably right. He is a practical man who has spent his career in direct contact with actual emergencies, and I am a comms officer who has spent my career monitoring a border from a distance, and my sense of what a pause in a formal message means is almost certainly more interpretive than the situation warrants. But I keep the account, and in the account the pause is there, and I have never found a reason to remove it. The Varathen Outer Quarantine Bureau sent us a technical document 3 months after the incident. 8 pages, coalition standard, precise and thorough. Frequency spectrum classifications, signal structure parameters, protocol descriptions for each spectrum band. The covering note said, in summary, "This document is provided for the purpose of updating your frequency classification systems. Please confirm receipt and acknowledge when your records have been updated." Patience updated its frequency pairing table within the hour. The document also included, at the end, a section labeled Supplementary Note, Operational Guidance. It said, "In the event that a Terran monitoring station detects a transmission on the Varathen Priority Distress Spectrum, which is distinct from the Priority Containment Spectrum and is described in Appendix 2, the Bureau would consider direct notification from the monitoring station to be appropriate and would assess any offer of Terran assistance on a case-by-case basis." I read that 3 times. I added a note to the frequency pairing table record confirming receipt and update. I made a separate entry in the station day log that said, "Varathen Bureau Supplementary Guidance acknowledged and filed. Priority Distress Spectrum Parameters integrated. Capability noted. Will monitor accordingly." 4 words and the update confirmation. The day log is not the place for longer analysis. I left one more line. I wrote, "Patience's table is current." The Varathen did not send a stand-away order and receive a ship that knew what to do. They sent a stand-away order and received a ship that found something to do with what it had brought. That is a different thing. Dr. Wern found the inhibitor pathway. Dane adapted the equipment. Strauss kept his crew present for 3 days when there was nothing left to do but be there. None of that was in the protocol that sent Comwater. None of it was in my dispatch recommendation. It was in the people on the ship, and in the fact that they had the right equipment for a different job that turned out to be adjacent to this one, and in the 11 hours of technical conversation that Wern and Ern's medical representative had built from nothing into something they could both stand on. The 11 crew members of the vessel Osavith Correct who survived are not in my account because they are mine to account for. They are in Ern's report, precisely and carefully documented, because he is the one who was there and who chose to be accurate about what contributed to what. I was 11 years at my console when the Varathen sent the burst that told their own ships to stand clear, and our table was old, and I could not make the case to clear the flag, and I filed the dispatch and wrote the memo and argued with myself for 80 minutes in the middle of the night and filed the dispatch. Comwater went. Wern found the inhibitor pathway. 11 people survived. Marshal Ern filed his report. The Bureau sent the document. The table is current. That is the account. What it means is not mine to say.